William Hastings was the most powerful man in England, yet he was dragged from a morning meeting and shoved onto a dirty building timber. Without a single trial, his execution was ordered right before lunch. This wasn't a mere political purge, but the deadly price of a guarded, forbidden romance. He was beheaded over a timber log, the fatal affair that doomed him. For decades, Hastings was King Edward IV's untouchable right hand. But the moment the king died, Hastings secretly claimed the royal mistress, Jane Shore. He thought owning this forbidden secret made him untouchable. Instead, it handed Richard III the perfect weapon to frame him for witchcraft, drop the axe, and steal the throne. In the mid-1400s, the rival houses of Lancaster and York fought a decades-long civil war for the English throne known as the Wars of the Roses. Traditional loyalties collapsed as nobles frequently shifted alliances to secure power and personal survival. This instability was driven by bastard feudalism, a system where a lord's political strength depended on his ability to fund a private army rather than his inherited title. Born around the year 1430, William Hastings was a product of this militarized society. He was a Yorkist, down to the marrow of his bones. His family had a long-established and lucrative tradition of serving the House of York. His father, Sir Leonard Hastings, had been a trusted, loyal retainer to Richard, Duke of York. Unlike many nobles who relied on royal bloodlines, Hastings built his power through action. He was not a blood relative of the young, charismatic man who would become King Edward IV. While his wife, Catherine Neville, was a first cousin to the king, William's bond with Edward was forged in the mud and blood of warfare. He was not a soft palace courtier who stayed safely behind thick castle walls. He was a frontline soldier and a battlefield brother. In the late 1450s and the early months of 1461, the English Civil War reached a fever pitch. The Lancastrian forces, loyal to the unstable King Henry VI and his Queen Margaret of Anjou, were ravaging the country. William Hastings rode to war. He fought shoulder to shoulder with the young Edward in some of the most horrific, decisive military clashes of the medieval era. Historical chronicles explicitly place Hastings at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross in February 1461. Here, in the freezing Welsh marches, the Yorkist army faced a massive Lancastrian force. Before the battle began, the troops witnessed a bizarre atmospheric illusion. A parhelion appeared in the freezing sky, creating the optical illusion of three distinct suns shining at once. While many soldiers panicked, viewing it as an evil omen, Edward brilliantly rallied his men, claiming it represented the Holy Trinity shining favor upon the House of York. The Yorkists crushed the Lancastrians, but Mortimer's Cross was merely a skirmish compared to the nightmare that awaited them. A few weeks later, in March 1461, William Hastings stood his ground in the freezing hell of the Battle of Towton. Many military historians and modern battlefield archaeologists widely consider the Battle of Towton to be the largest, longest, and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. It is estimated that nearly 80,000 men took the field that day. It was fought in the middle of a blinding late-season snowstorm. The wind howled across the Yorkshire plateau. Visibility was reduced to mere feet. The Yorkist archers, utilizing the tailwind, fired massive volleys of arrows that blinded and decimated the advancing Lancastrian lines. The arrows flew so thick they literally blotted out what little gray light remained in the sky. When the arrows ran out, the two massive armies crashed into each other. For 10 exhausting hours, tens of thousands of armored Englishmen slaughtered each other in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Men slipped and drowned in the blood-soaked mud. The fighting was so intense, the crush of bodies so severe, and the casualties so massive that contemporary accounts claim the nearby River Cock ran red with human blood for days afterward. It is estimated that up to 28,000 men died on that single Sunday. It was an entire generation of English nobility, wiped out in the snow. William Hastings survived this unimaginable massacre. He stood in the mud alongside Edward. The psychological bond forged in that level of primal survival is difficult for modern minds to fully comprehend. They had looked destruction in the face and survived. To honor his unwavering loyalty, physical courage, and martial skill, Edward IV personally knighted William Hastings right there, surrounded by the tens of thousands of dead on the freezing battlefield of Towton. When Edward IV finally marched his exhausted, victorious army into London and secured the throne, the new king knew exactly who he could trust. He rewarded his battlefield brother with sweeping power. The newly crowned king immediately elevated William to the peerage. He was made Baron Hastings, but empty aristocratic titles were only the beginning of his ascent. Edward handed Hastings the heavy levers of the state machinery. Hastings was appointed as the master of the mint. This was a powerful, lucrative position. It gave him direct oversight of the nation's currency, the production of coinage, and the royal treasuries. He was appointed as the lieutenant of Calais. In the mid-15th century, Calais was England's most crucial military and economic foothold on the continent of France. It housed the largest standing professional garrison in the English military. Controlling Calais meant controlling the English Channel. It meant controlling a massive portion of the nation's trade wealth through the wool staple. Hastings held the keys to England's front door. His most intimate role was his direct appointment as the Lord Chamberlain. In the highly ritualized Plantagenet court, the Lord Chamberlain was not a mere domestic servant. He was the master of the king's private daily household. The political architecture of the 15th century was built on physical access. If a lord wanted a royal pardon or a merchant wanted a lucrative land grant, they had to go through William Hastings. Hastings managed the king's schedule. He dictated who was allowed into the privy chamber to see the king. He determined who spoke to the sovereign and who received vital royal favors. He was the ultimate gatekeeper. If William Hastings liked you, your family could rise to immense prominence and wealth overnight. If William Hastings barred your entry to the king's chambers, your political career was permanently paralyzed. Through this suffocating bottleneck of power, Hastings amassed a massive personal fortune. He did not hide his wealth. In a militarized society, hiding wealth was a sign of weakness. Hastings weaponized his money. He used his funds to build cutting-edge, fortified stone strongholds in the Midlands. He constructed architectural statements like Ashby de la Zouch and the moated Kirby Muxloe Castle. These were not just comfortable country homes. They were heavy military garrisons, specifically designed to withstand artillery fire and to project unquestionable regional dominance. Furthermore, he utilized the system of bastard feudalism to build a loyal private army. He bound hundreds of local knights, esquires, and gentry to his personal service through formal written legal indentures. They wore his livery badge, the black bull's head. By the early 1470s, William Hastings was effectively the second most powerful man in the Kingdom of England. He walked the halls of Westminster Palace and the stone corridors of Windsor Castle with the unshakable certainty of a man who knew he was untouchable. He had bled for the king. He controlled the king's schedule. He controlled the armies in France. He commanded his own private army at home. Power in the medieval royal court is inherently fragile. It is a house built on shifting sand. William Hastings was about to complicate his own unassailable position through his daily management of the king's scandalous private life. He had built an impenetrable fortress of political and military might. But the greatest threat to his survival would not come from an enemy army on a snowy battlefield. It would come from within the royal bedchamber. The deeply divided, toxic environment of the king's private court was a labyrinth of warring factions. Women fiercely competed for the king's heart. The power William Hastings wielded as Lord Chamberlain was absolute. He physically controlled the space surrounding the sovereign. This immense structural power eventually destroyed him because of the specific nature of the monarch he served. The king lived a dual contradictory life. The king was a physical giant of the medieval era. He stood roughly 6 feet 4 inches tall in his prime, clad in plate armor on the battlefield. He was a brilliant and undefeated military tactician. He commanded awe. But in the quiet years of peacetime, the king's personality shifted. Surviving historical chronicles and detailed accounts of foreign ambassadors universally agree on one undeniable point. King Edward IV was notoriously relentless in his hedonism. His physical appetites were legendary across the royal courts of Europe. He consumed massive quantities of rich, spiced food. He drank vast amounts of expensive imported wine. His appetite for women was insatiable. He famously pursued the wives and daughters of his own loyal courtiers. As the Lord Chamberlain, William Hastings did not just manage the king's formal state meetings, he actively managed the king's vices. Hastings was the ultimate royal enabler. He organized the late-night banquets. He facilitated the king's scandalous, complex, private life. If the king desired a specific woman in the city of London, it was often the Lord Chamberlain's discreet network of servants who arranged the logistics. Hastings was the keeper of the king's darkest secrets. This extreme proximity made Hastings incredibly powerful. He was the one man the king could not afford to lose. But this role also created bitter, entrenched political enemies. The greatest, most lethal enemy William Hastings faced was not a rival warlord. It was the king's own legally wedded wife, Elizabeth Woodville. The marriage between King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville was a political and social earthquake. It shattered the established norms of English diplomacy. In the spring of 1464, the young victorious king was expected to marry a foreign princess. The powerful Earl of Warwick was actively negotiating a vital marriage treaty with the Kingdom of France. A French bride would secure international peace and legitimize the New Yorkist dynasty on the global stage. Instead, guided by his own reckless lust, the king married in secret. Elizabeth Woodville was not a foreign royal. She was a mere English widow of relatively minor provincial nobility. Even more shockingly to the political establishment, she was the widow of a Lancastrian knight who had died fighting against the House of York. She was also several years older than the king, and she already had 2 sons from her previous marriage. When the secret marriage was revealed to the royal council in the autumn of 1464, the old Yorkist nobility was stunned. The Earl of Warwick was publicly humiliated. The sheer shock of the king's choice was only the beginning. The true terror for the old aristocracy was the queen's massive, ambitious, extended family. Elizabeth Woodville was the eldest of 14 siblings. When she was officially crowned queen, the Woodville family flooded the royal court like an invading army. They were politically ravenous. They were desperate for wealth, and they held the ultimate prize, the ear of the king. The queen used her influence to secure lucrative, controversial marriages for her brothers and sisters. She systematically snatched up the wealthiest orphaned heirs and heiresses in the kingdom. She married her 20-year-old brother, John Woodville, to the wealthy Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. The Duchess was famously in her late 60s. Many contemporary chroniclers explicitly recorded their disgust at this transaction, viewing it as a gross manipulation of the marriage market for financial greed. The Woodvilles grabbed massive rural estates. They collected aristocratic titles. They seized key political and financial offices. The old battle-hardened Yorkshire nobility watched this hostile takeover with revulsion. Men who had bled in the snow at Towton found themselves suddenly sidelined. They viewed the Woodvilles as greedy upstarts who had hijacked the crown. William Hastings passionately hated the Woodville family. He viewed them as a direct existential threat to the stability of the realm. More personally, he viewed them as a direct threat to his own hard-won centralized influence. For over a decade, the glittering Yorkist court became a pressurized, dangerous powder keg. It was divided into two opposing armed factions. On one side stood the old Yorkist loyalists. This faction was led quietly and efficiently by William Hastings from his position as Lord Chamberlain. On the other side stood the Queen's extended family, backed by the fierce maternal protection of Elizabeth Woodville. Hastings survived this toxic environment by making himself operationally indispensable to the king. He controlled the military garrison at Calais. He controlled the mint. To counter the Queen's psychological influence over the king, Hastings aligned himself with the one person in London who held the king's heart as tightly as his wife did. Into this lethal, faction-driven court stepped a young woman named Elizabeth Lambert. History and centuries of romantic literature remembers her simply as Jane Shore. Jane Shore was not a high-born noblewoman. She did not possess an ancient title. She was the daughter of a wealthy, successful London merchant named John Lambert. She was raised in the bustling, mercantile heart of the city, far removed from the lethal politics of the royal court. She had been respectably married to a prominent mercer and goldsmith named William Shore, but the marriage was unhappy. Many historians note that she sought an annulment on the grounds of her husband's impotence. With the king's heavy-handed legal intervention, the marriage was annulled by the church. She was free, and King Edward IV was utterly captivated by her. The famous Tudor historian Thomas More, writing decades later but relying on the memories of those who knew her, recorded a vivid description. He noted that the king openly called her his merriest mistress. Contemporary accounts strongly suggest Jane Shore possessed a magnetic, addictive personality. She was widely considered one of the most beautiful women in the capital. Her enduring appeal to the king was not merely physical. She was incredibly witty. She was relentlessly charming. Crucially, she could read and write fluently. This was a valued skill that allowed her to engage the king intellectually, providing a sharp, entertaining contrast to the heavy, stressful burdens of statecraft. Most importantly for William Hastings, Jane Shore operated differently than Queen Elizabeth Woodville. Unlike the Woodville family, Jane Shore did not ruthlessly use the king's bed to steal vast tracts of land. She did not demand titles for her relatives. She did not engage in bloody political purges of her enemies. Instead, many historical records indicate she used her influence to secure royal pardons. She quietly helped those who had fallen out of favor with the volatile king. She used her unique position to soften Edward's sudden bursts of anger. She acted as a diplomatic back channel. Because of this specific behavior, she was popular with the working people of London. She was highly respected by the old Yorkist nobility. William Hastings, a master political tactician, recognized her strategic value immediately. As Lord Chamberlain, Hastings controlled the physical doors to the king's private chambers. He facilitated Jane Shore's access to the monarch. He protected her physical position within the complex hierarchy of the court. More importantly, Hastings used his political weight and his private military network to shield her. He protected the merchant's daughter from the burning jealousy of Queen Elizabeth Woodville. A quiet, effective, and mutually beneficial alliance slowly formed. It was an alliance between the hardened veteran warlord and the brilliant royal mistress. They were united by a shared, deep-seated hatred and fear of the Woodville faction. Hastings protected the mistress from the queen's wrath. The mistress in return kept the king happy. She subtly influenced his decisions away from the queen's grasping family. For years, this delicate, high-wire political balancing act held the Kingdom of England together. Hastings controlled the machinery of government. Jane Shore entertained the emotional whims of the monarch. The Woodvilles seethed in the background, accumulating wealth but unable to dislodge the Lord Chamberlain from the king's side. They were locked in a tense Cold War. It was a fragile peace built entirely on the massive physical presence of King Edward IV. As long as the giant king lived, the factions were forced to tolerate each other. But the fragile foundation of English politics rested on the heartbeat of that one single man. The king's hedonistic lifestyle was rapidly destroying his physical body. In April 1483, that heartbeat suddenly stopped. The death of King Edward IV sent shock waves across the European continent. He was only 40 years old. To the general public, he had seemed vibrant and invincible. Many historians debate the exact medical cause of his sudden demise. Some suggest he caught a severe chill during a fishing trip on the River Thames. Others argue he succumbed to a massive stroke or severe gastrointestinal illness. What is universally agreed upon is that his body, likely weakened by years of overindulgence, heavy drinking, and rapid weight gain, gave out. Within a matter of days, the Giant of York was dead. He left behind a 12-year-old son, Prince Edward, as the direct heir to the throne. The political power vacuum was instantaneous. It was absolute, and it was deeply terrifying. In the 15th century, a boy king meant a regency council. It meant a vicious, bloody scramble to control the physical person of the child. Whoever physically controlled the boy king controlled the royal seal. Whoever controlled the seal controlled the wealth, the legal apparatus, and the military strength of England. The Cold War was instantly over. The hot war for the crown had begun. The Woodville family mobilized their network immediately. At the exact moment of the king's death, the young Prince Edward was not in London. He was residing far away at Ludlow Castle in the Welsh Marches. Crucially, he was surrounded almost entirely by his Woodville relatives. His primary guardian was his maternal uncle, Anthony Woodville, the powerful Earl Rivers. Queen Elizabeth Woodville, sitting in the capital, recognized that her moment had finally arrived. She planned to rush the boy king to London with a massive armed escort. She intended to crown him immediately, bypassing the traditional mourning period. By rushing the coronation, she would establish a permanent Woodville Regency Council. She would legally cut out the old Yorkist guard. She would finally have the power to destroy her enemies. William Hastings sat in his fortified London townhouse and watched the Queen's maneuvers with cold dread. He was a veteran of the battlefield. He recognized a flanking maneuver when he saw one. He realized the extreme danger of his current position. If the Woodvilles successfully seized unchecked control of the new government, Hastings knew his glittering, lucrative career was permanently over. They would strip him of the Lord Chamberlain title. They would take his keys. They would confiscate his lands in the Midlands. Given the blood-soaked animosity between them, they might manufacture treason charges and take his head. He had spent a decade blocking their ambitions. They would demand public revenge. Hastings knew he had to act immediately. To survive the Woodvilles' rapid mobilization, he needed to project unshakable dominance and prove to the terrified nobility that he was the true, unbroken inheritor of Edward IV's regime. He had to show his enemies he was not afraid of their armies. To achieve this, the veteran warlord made a move that was breathtakingly arrogant. He publicly claimed the late king's most beloved mistress, Jane Shore. In the paranoid political atmosphere of 1483, this was not a simple romance. In the brutal calculus of the Plantagenet court, it was a loud, unspoken declaration of political dominance. By claiming the late king's famous mistress, Hastings explicitly established himself as the new alpha male of the Yorkist establishment. Many modern historians argue that in 15th century political psychology, the transfer of a highly public royal mistress was often viewed as a direct transfer of the royal aura itself. Hastings was signaling to the entire court, and specifically to the Woodvilles, that he had inherited Edward IV's power. Hastings genuinely believed his military history made him safe. He believed his network of armed allies made his position unassailable. He felt invincible. But this public sexual and political alliance contained a fatal contradictory flaw. It was a massive vulnerability that Hastings inexplicably overlooked. William Hastings hated the Woodville family and was preparing for a total war against her bloodline. However, Jane Shore did not share his rigid factional loyalty. Surviving historical records strongly suggest that Jane Shore had previously maintained a close, friendly relationship with another powerful man at court. That man was Thomas Grey, the Marquis of Dorset. Thomas Grey was not a Yorkist loyalist. He was Queen Elizabeth Woodville's eldest son from her very first marriage. He was the Queen's own blood, he was wealthy, and he was one of William Hastings's primary political rivals. Some contemporary chronicles hint that Jane Shore may have been romantically involved with Dorset, concurrently with her relationship with Hastings. While the romantic timeline remains a subject of historical debate, the political reality of the connection was devastating. By publicly sharing his bed, and likely sharing his unguarded political thoughts, with a woman who had intimate ties to his bitter enemies, Hastings created a massive chink in his political armor. He firmly believed he was asserting ultimate dominance over the court. Instead, he was handing his political opponents an effective, invisible weapon. Jane Shore was suddenly caught in the crossfire. She was a merchant's daughter navigating a deadly maze between two powerful warring factions. And Hastings, blinded by his own immense ego and his unshakable belief in his invulnerability, failed to see the danger. This reckless move did not just anger the Queen, it caught the sharp, calculating, and ruthless attention of a different player on the board. It drew the cold eyes of the late king's ambitious younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was a hardened, brilliant military commander. He had spent the last decade ruling the turbulent north of England with an iron fist on behalf of his older brother. When the news of King Edward IV's death reached Richard at his stronghold in Middleham Castle, he recognized the supreme danger posed by the Woodville family. He knew that if the Queen Mother established a permanent regency, his own life and his vast northern estates would be forfeit. Richard began to ride south toward London. He was accompanied by a massive retinue of armed, fiercely loyal northern soldiers. At this precise moment in April 1483, Richard of Gloucester and William Hastings were united in their political goals. They were both traditional Yorkists. They both despised the Woodvilles. They both wanted to secure the young King Edward V and strip the Queen Mother of her power. Surviving historical dispatches confirm that Hastings actively wrote letters to Richard in the north. Hastings deliberately urged the Duke to hurry south. He provided Richard with classified military intelligence regarding the Woodville's troop movements. Hastings essentially invited the wolf into the city, believing he held the leash. On April 30th, 1483, Richard of Gloucester executed a bloodless military coup. He intercepted the young King Edward V at the town of Stony Stratford. The boy king was being escorted to London by his Woodville uncle, the Earl Rivers. Richard acted with sudden precision. He arrested the Earl Rivers. He arrested the king's half-brother, Richard Grey. He seized physical custody of the 12-year-old monarch. When the news of the sudden arrests at Stony Stratford reached London, absolute panic erupted. Queen Elizabeth Woodville instantly realized her political power had collapsed. She grabbed her younger children and fled directly into the religious sanctuary of Westminster Abbey, barricading herself behind the sacred walls. When William Hastings heard the news, his reaction was different. Contemporary chronicles record that Hastings was overjoyed. He publicly celebrated in the streets of London. He believed his brilliant political strategy had worked perfectly. He had used his alliance with Richard of Gloucester to destroy the Woodville faction without shedding a drop of blood in the capital. Hastings confidently reassured the terrified nobility of London. He declared that the arrests at Stony Stratford were merely a necessary political correction. He swore on his honor that the young king was safe in his uncle's care. Hastings genuinely believed he had won the political war. He believed he would retain his position as Lord Chamberlain, acting as the senior statesman alongside Richard's official role as Lord Protector. He felt vindicated, but Hastings had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had misunderstood the vast, dark, and rapidly shifting depths of Richard of Gloucester's ambition. In May 1483, Richard arrived in London with the young king. The city formally welcomed them. Richard was officially recognized by the royal council as the Lord Protector of the realm. He was now the legal ruler of England until the boy came of age. But as Richard settled into his new role, he looked at the political landscape. He realized a terrifying, inescapable truth. A protectorship was temporary. In a few short years, young Edward V would reach his majority. He would take full control of the government. And when he did, he would undoubtedly recall his beloved Woodville relatives from exile. He would inevitably seek bloody revenge against the man who had imprisoned his favorite uncle. Richard of Gloucester realized that as long as Edward V wore the crown, his own life would always be in lethal danger. The only permanent way to guarantee his physical survival and to maintain his grip on power was to seize the throne completely for himself. Richard decided he had to become king, but executing a usurpation against a direct, legitimate male heir is a dangerous maneuver. It requires the unquestioned backing of the highest nobility. Richard began to quietly test the political waters in London. He set up dual, secretive councils. He met with his closest northern allies at his private residence, Crosby Place. Meanwhile, he sent the rest of the nobility to hold routine, mundane meetings at the Tower of London. He needed to know exactly who would support a coup d'etat and who would violently oppose it. His most crucial target was William Hastings. Hastings was the wealthiest, most respected, and most militarily powerful man in the southern half of the kingdom. If Hastings supported the usurpation, the rest of the nobility would meekly fall in line. If Hastings opposed it, Richard would face a massive civil war in the streets of the capital. Richard used a trusted intermediary, a lawyer named William Catesby, to quietly sound out the Lord Chamberlain. Catesby was instructed to delicately broach the subject of bypassing the young king. The historical record regarding this exact conversation is guarded, but the outcome was absolute. William Catesby reported back to Richard of Gloucester with devastating news. Hastings had refused. The Lord Chamberlain was unshakably loyal to the bloodline of his dead battlefield brother, Edward IV. Hastings made it explicitly clear that he would fight to his dying breath to see the 12-year-old Edward V crowned as the rightful king of England. In that single, unseen moment of political defiance, William Hastings signed his own death warrant. Richard of Gloucester was a cold, pragmatic military operator. He realized immediately that Hastings was an immovable, heavily armed brick wall standing directly between him and the English throne. The Lord Chamberlain could not be bribed. He could not be intimidated. Therefore, the Lord Chamberlain had to die. But Richard faced a massive, complex legal and military problem. He could not simply arrest William Hastings on standard political charges. Hastings commanded immense respect. He possessed vast wealth. If Richard tried to openly, legally challenge the Lord Chamberlain in a courtroom, or if he tried to deploy royal troops against him in the streets, the old Yorkist nobility would instantly rally to Hastings' defense. A bloody rebellion would erupt. Richard needed a creative, devastating pretext. He needed a legal or moral justification for immediate, extreme action that would paralyze the nobility before they could draw their swords. Richard of Gloucester looked closely at William Hastings. He studied his habits. He looked at his public, arrogant affair with Jane Shore. He observed her known intimate connection to the Woodville family. In the dark, superstitious atmosphere of 1483, Richard twisted these disparate facts into a brilliant, deadly, and fabricated conspiracy theory. He designed a psychological trap perfectly tailored to the fears of the 15th century, ensuring Hastings would never see it coming. The blueprint for state-sponsored murder was complete. The most powerful man in England was about to walk directly into a locked room from which he would never return. Friday, June 13th, 1483. The morning air in the capital city of London was thick with an oppressive, unseen political tension. The boy king, the 12-year-old Edward V, was securely housed within the sprawling, fortified royal apartments of the Tower of London. He was waiting for his coronation. On this specific morning, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, called an exclusive mandatory royal council meeting. He deliberately split the nobility. He kept his closest, most loyal northern allies at his private London residence, Crosby Place. Meanwhile, he sent the traditional Yorkist lords, the men whose loyalty to the boy king remained unbroken, to meet at the Tower. The location chosen for this meeting was the White Tower. This was the ancient, massive stone keep that formed the impenetrable core of the Tower of London complex. It was a building designed by William the Conqueror to project state authority. William Hastings, the Lord Chamberlain of England, rode his horse through the heavy gates of the fortress. Surviving historical chronicles explicitly emphasize his fatal lack of suspicion. He felt secure. Just the night before, he had dined with his closest allies. He genuinely believed that He and Richard of Gloucester were operating with the exact same political goal: to manage the young king and permanently sideline the Woodvilles. Hastings walked up the stone steps and entered the heavy wooden doors of the council chamber. He sat down at the large oak table. He was surrounded by men he considered his absolute peers, his longtime political allies, and his personal friends. Also present in the stone room were several of the most powerful men in the realm. Thomas Stanley, the wealthy and politically flexible Lord Stanley, was there. John Morton, the brilliant, politically dangerous Bishop of Ely, sat at the table. Thomas Rotherham, the Archbishop of York and former Lord Chancellor, was also in attendance. These were the structural pillars of the English government, and they were walking directly into an ambush. The meeting began in a state of manufactured theatrical calm. Richard of Gloucester arrived slightly late to his own council. His demeanor was meticulously disarming. Contemporary chronicles, specifically the detailed writings of the Tudor historian Thomas More, record that Richard was polite. He was affable. He smiled warmly and apologized to the lords for oversleeping. Then, Richard executed a master class in psychological manipulation. He turned his attention specifically to Bishop Morton. He smiled warmly at the clergyman and made a specific, unusual, and seemingly mundane request. Richard noted that he had recently seen some excellent, fresh, beautifully ripe strawberries growing in the bishop's private garden in the Holborn district of London. He politely asked if the bishop might send a personal servant to fetch a bowl of them for the council to enjoy during their long deliberations. Bishop Morton, eager to please the powerful Lord Protector, immediately and enthusiastically agreed. A servant was dispatched into the city. This specific historical detail, the polite request for the Holborn strawberries, is a heavily analyzed moment in English political history. It was not a random idle thought from a hungry duke. It was a calculated, cynical, theatrical device. The deliberate mention of something as pleasant, ordinary, harmless, and domestic as fresh summer fruit was designed to put William Hastings and the other counselors completely at ease. It forcefully lowered their psychological defenses. It convinced them that this was merely a routine, friendly morning meeting among the high lords of the realm. It masked the scent of blood. With the tension in the heavy stone room dissolved, Richard of Gloucester politely excused himself. He stated he needed to attend to a brief private matter. He stepped out of the heavy oak doors of the council chamber. He left the most powerful men in England sitting comfortably at the table, casually discussing mundane state business, waiting for their fruit. When Richard returned approximately an hour later, the carefully constructed, polite illusion of peace violently shattered. The atmosphere in the stone room mutated instantly. The air grew cold. Richard's demeanor had fundamentally transformed. The affable, smiling Duke was gone. His face was dark. He was reportedly biting his lower lip intensely, a physical gesture widely recognized by his nervous contemporaries as a sign of deep, engineered fury. He stepped up to the head of the heavy oak table. He did not sit down. He looked at the stunned, suddenly silent counselors and demanded an answer to a legally loaded question. He asked the highest lords of the realm what punishment was legally and morally deserved by those who were actively plotting his physical destruction. William Hastings, feeling secure in his established position as the senior Yorkist lord, and believing Richard was about to formally accuse the Woodville family of a mundane political plot, spoke up. He boldly declared that whoever was plotting against the Lord Protector deserved to be punished as a heinous, unforgivable traitor to the crown. Then, Richard of Gloucester sprang the trap. He abruptly rolled up the left sleeve of his doublet. He extended his arm across the wooden table, revealing a withered, shrunken, and deformed limb. Modern historians, osteologists, and medical experts, analyzing Richard III's actual physical remains discovered under a Leicester parking lot in 2012, now confirm that he suffered from severe adolescent-onset idiopathic scoliosis. This intense spinal curvature significantly affected his posture, his breathing, and the symmetry of his body, making one shoulder visibly higher than the other. But in that tense locked room in 1483, Richard did not offer a rational medical explanation for his physical condition. He offered a supernatural one. He slammed his fist onto the table. He roared at the paralyzed counselors. He explicitly, loudly accused the Queen Dowager, Elizabeth Woodville, of conspiring against him. And crucially, he linked the Queen directly to another woman. Richard claimed that the Queen and that witch, Jane Shore, had used demonic sorcery. He claimed they had used physical effigies, dark magic, and wicked enchantments to cripple his body, wither his arm, and plot his physical death. The accusation was breathtaking in its sheer audacity. Richard of Gloucester was directly accusing William Hastings' current visible mistress of witchcraft and high treason against the realm. By utilizing the specific charge of witchcraft, Richard was brilliantly bypassing all standard legal defenses. In the superstitious 15th century, sorcery was an invisible, terrifying crime. It was incredibly difficult to disprove in a court of law. It bypassed the need for intercepted letters, signed confessions, or written evidence of a political conspiracy. William Hastings was utterly blindsided. He was a veteran military commander. He was a man used to fighting armed men on open battlefields in the snow. He was used to navigating complex financial ledgers at the Mint and negotiating international political treaties in Calais. He was not equipped to navigate sudden, hysterical accusations of demonic sorcery in a locked stone room. He was forced to defend the life of his lover without outright calling the powerful Duke of Gloucester a liar to his face. Stunned, confused, and desperately trying to find a diplomatic middle ground, William Hastings stammered a fatal qualified response. He looked at Richard's withered arm. He looked at the furious Duke. And Hastings said, "Certainly, my lord, if they have so heinously done, they be worthy of heinous punishment." Richard of Gloucester seized upon that single hesitant word instantly. He slapped his open hand heavily onto the heavy wooden table. Many historians believe this was a prearranged acoustic signal to the armed guards waiting silently in the corridor outside. Richard shouted with venomous theatricality, "Thou servest me, I ween, with ifs and with ands. I tell thee they have so done, and that I will make good on thy body, traitor." The use of the simple word if was all the legal and moral justification Richard needed. In Richard's manufactured outrage, implying even a shadow of a doubt about his wild accusation of witchcraft, was an act of high treason in itself. It proved in Richard's carefully constructed narrative that the Lord Chamberlain was actively protecting the demonic conspirators. The moment Richard shouted the word traitor, the heavy oak doors of the council chamber burst open. A single hesitant word had sealed his fate. The carefully constructed illusion of a state meeting was brutally annihilated. Armed men flooded into the locked stone room. They were Richard's personal retainers, hardened soldiers brought down from the militarized northern borders. They poured into the chamber wielding heavy halberds, drawn swords, and iron maces. Terrifying chaos erupted within the White Tower. The most untouchable lords of the English realm were suddenly reduced to panicked targets. The peaceful morning meeting devolved into a frantic physical scuffle. Weapons swung wildly in the confined space. Heavy wooden chairs were overturned. During the sudden confusion, Thomas Stanley, the wealthy and politically flexible Lord Stanley, dove frantically beneath the heavy oak table to save his own life. But he was not fast enough. A soldier's weapon swung down, striking a glancing but severe blow. Lord Stanley's head was split open. Blood poured onto the floor of the Royal Council chamber. John Morton, the brilliant Bishop of Ely, and Thomas Rotherham, the Archbishop of York, were physically restrained. These were men of the Holy Church, traditionally immune from physical assault. The northern soldiers ignored their ecclesiastical status. They were roughly hauled to their feet and placed under heavy arrest. But the primary target of this military strike was the Lord Chamberlain. The armed guards converged directly on William Hastings. They grabbed him right out of his chair. They physically subdued the veteran Yorkist warlord. The man who had effectively run the government of England just an hour prior was now a helpless prisoner in his own fortress. Richard of Gloucester stood amidst the bleeding councillors and the shattered furniture. He had successfully bypassed every legal protection William Hastings possessed. This violent execution completely annihilated the absolute bedrock of English common law. According to centuries of established legal precedent, specifically rooted in the Magna Carta of 1215, a nobleman of Hastings's rank possessed undeniable legal rights. He had the constitutional right to a formal public trial by a jury of his aristocratic peers. He had the legal right to hear the evidence against him. He had the right to mount a formal legal defense. Richard of Gloucester ignored the Magna Carta completely. He operated not as a Lord Protector, but with the brutal efficiency of a military dictator seizing control of the state. He looked down at the restrained Lord Chamberlain. Richard declared to the panicked room that he would not eat his lunch until he saw William Hastings's head permanently separated from his body. This was not a theatrical exaggeration. It was a cold, pragmatic military timeline. Richard of Gloucester was executing a violent coup d'etat. He was a brilliant tactical commander. He knew perfectly well that William Hastings was widely beloved by the citizens of London. He knew Hastings commanded thousands of armed, loyal retainers stationed within the city walls. If the rumors of Hastings' sudden arrest leaked out into the crowded streets, the old Yorkist nobility would instantly rally to his defense. A bloody rebellion would erupt before the sun went down. The Tower of London would be besieged. To prevent a catastrophic civil war, Richard's violent strike had to be an undeniable fait accompli. The Lord Chamberlain had to be legally and physically dead before the city of London even realized he was in danger. Speed was Richard's greatest weapon. Because of this frantic rush to eliminate the threat, William Hastings was denied every fundamental dignity. He begged for a formal trial. He was ignored. He pleaded desperately for just a few short hours to write his last will and testament. He was one of the wealthiest men in the kingdom. He needed to secure the financial future of his wife, Catherine Neville, and his young children. He needed to formally distribute his vast estates across the Midlands to prevent them from being swallowed by the crown. His request was coldly denied. He was given only a few frantic minutes to save his eternal soul. Surviving historical accounts record that the guards scrambled to find a bewildered priest who happened to be walking nearby within the tower grounds. Hastings was thrown to his knees on the grass. He hastily mumbled his final confession to this random clergyman. Then, the guards dragged the veteran warlord onto the open green space, located outside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. This area was known as the Tower Green. Normally, the state execution of a high-ranking English peer was a highly orchestrated, solemn public event. It was planned days or weeks in advance. A proper, elevated wooden scaffold was constructed by royal carpenters. It was draped in heavy black cloth. A skilled executioner was brought in. A smooth, curved, deeply indented wooden block was prepared specifically for the condemned man's neck. But on the frantic morning of June 13th, 1483, nothing was ready. The guards were in a panicked hurry to appease the Duke of Gloucester. Before the noon lunch bell officially rang, they did not have the time to build a scaffold. They did not have the time to find black velvet cloth, and they lacked a proper executioner's block. Instead, the guards looked around the Tower Green. Some local carpenters had recently been doing routine repair work on the stone walls of the fortress. A rough, discarded piece of heavy building timber, a dirty, splintered wooden log, had been left lying haphazardly on the grass. The guards grabbed William Hastings. They forced the Lord Chamberlain violently, face down into the dirt. They shoved his neck roughly against the jagged edge of this discarded piece of construction scrap wood. It was a filthy, deliberately humiliating end. This was the man who had worn custom-tailored velvet and cloth of gold. He had effectively run the government and the economy of England. He had survived the blinding, blood-soaked snows of the Battle of Towton. He had built magnificent stone castles. Now he was dying in the dirt like a common traitor, his neck pressed against architectural debris. With a single swing of a heavy iron axe, the executioner brought the blade down. The head of William Hastings was permanently severed from his body. True to his sociopathic oath, Richard of Gloucester immediately turned around and went to eat his lunch. The psychological shock waves of this extrajudicial murder rippled instantly outward. Richard knew he had to immediately control the public narrative before the citizens of London rioted in the streets. Before Hastings' blood had even dried on the Tower Green, Richard dispatched royal heralds into the city. The heralds frantically read a manufactured official royal proclamation. This proclamation declared that William Hastings had been actively conspiring with the Woodville faction to assassinate the Lord Protector in the very council chamber itself. The proclamation explicitly stated that Hastings was executed immediately because the state was in imminent peril. The Tudor historian Thomas More later noted a darkly humorous detail about this specific proclamation. The proclamation was long. It was highly detailed. It was flawlessly written on expensive parchment. It was obvious to any educated citizen in London that such a complex legal document could not possibly have been drafted, copied, and distributed in the mere 2 hours since Hastings was allegedly discovered as a traitor. The citizens realized immediately that the official proclamation had been written entirely in advance. The conspiracy belonged entirely to Richard, but no one dared to speak a word of protest. The immediate aftermath of this execution was swift and cold. Having eliminated his greatest political and military obstacle, Richard turned his ruthless attention to the rest of the kingdom. The Lord Chamberlain was dead in the dirt. Richard of Gloucester's brilliant coup d'etat was secured because the only physical, military shield standing in his way had been shattered. Once the final, formidable military barrier was removed, the tragic endgame for the English crown was rapidly set in motion. The sudden extrajudicial murder of William Hastings paralyzed the English nobility. It sent a clear, chilling message across the country. If Richard could drag the Lord Chamberlain out of a state meeting and chop his head off on scrap wood in broad daylight, no one was safe. The ancient illusion of aristocratic invulnerability was permanently shattered. The deep fear of the executioner's axe kept the old Yorkist lords locked quietly inside their fortified homes. Without Hastings to block the path, Richard swiftly marginalized Jane Shore with a public penance, invalidated the marriage of the late king, and claimed the throne as King Richard III. The two young princes in the tower vanished into the dark, never to be seen alive again. The disappearance of the young princes was only made physically and politically possible because the executioner's axe claimed William Hastings first. He was the literal lock on their door. He was the ultimate gatekeeper. When the gatekeeper was dragged to the block, the wolves freely entered the nursery. The sudden death of William Hastings remains a subject of intense analysis among modern historians and political scientists today. Some historians view Richard III's sudden violence as a brutal preemptive strike, arguing that Hastings had formed a desperate alliance with the Woodvilles to assassinate the Duke of Gloucester. In this view, Richard was defending his own life in a kill or be killed environment. However, a significant majority of modern historical analysis views the execution differently. Many scholars see it as a calculated, cynical, and flawlessly executed tyrannical coup d'etat. They argue that Richard systematically removed the one man whose loyalty to the true heir was unshakable. He used a fabricated theatrical accusation of demonic witchcraft because he lacked written evidence of conventional treason. Richard ruthlessly exploited Hastings's arrogant public territorial affair with Jane Shore, using the mistress as his legal and moral justification for state-sponsored murder. What is undeniable about the event is the terrifying speed and illegality of the act. It exposed the vulnerability of the English nobility. It proved that in the face of a ruthless political operator willing to ignore the ancient rule of law, inherited aristocratic titles and vast wealth meant nothing. Raw military force, deployed with paralyzing surprise, dictated the future of England. When we look back at the life of William Hastings, we see a profound tragedy of human nature. He was a man who survived the brutal physical combat of the Wars of the Roses. He survived the freezing, blood-soaked snows of Towton. He survived decades of lethal factional warfare at the highest levels of the royal court. He successfully built a financial and military empire that rivaled the sovereign himself. Yet he was ultimately defeated by his own massive hubris in a quiet, locked boardroom. He fatally believed that his long history of military loyalty made him safe. He believed his vast wealth, his fortified stone castles in the Midlands, and his high status made him invulnerable to the shifting tides of court politics. He thought taking the dead king's mistress was a brilliant territorial display of his own unquestioned power. He tragically failed to realize he was handing his greatest political enemy the exact psychological weapon needed to destroy him. His story is a stark historical reminder that echoes through the centuries. In the high-stakes lethal game of political power, complacency is the ultimate enemy. William Hastings spent his entire adult life building impenetrable fortified castles of stone, but he forgot to guard his own ego. He forgot to guard his own words, and in the end, a single hesitant two-letter word in a locked room cost him his head, his legacy, and everything he had ever built.